I have played 24 hours of Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, and in that time, I have come to the conclusion that this is just as much of a Prince of Persia game as any from the classic Sands of Time trilogy. In fact, this might just be the perfect evolution of those games and everything they were about. I'm making this review because this franchise means a lot to me, and seeing this game be as great as it is makes me happy for all the fans like myself, who have been waiting and begging Ubisoft to give us anything, something, for years now. Personally, I've been playing Prince of Persia games longer than I can remember, whether it was just watching an older sibling play or me taking on the game myself, and I've been obsessed with these games ever since. The grand adventure, the problem solving, the combat, the cool dynamic created by time powers, the fun and unrealistic traversal systems, and so many of the other things these games offer, which is why I was very surprised to find out this 2D side-scroller Metroidvania had all those things and much more. This game goes above and beyond what that original trilogy established, so if you were on the edge about whether it was actually worth playing, the answer is yes, because it's really that good. So when I say it goes above and beyond, what exactly am I talking about specifically? Well, this game feels like a love letter to the fans and to that original trilogy, from the tile sets, the music, the enemy design, all the way down to Sargon's attire. However, all of that is only on the surface because this is a love letter down to its gameplay too, which has so many elements from those original games return in unique and interesting ways that feel new and familiar at the same time. I felt the same level of satisfaction figuring something out or getting through difficult challenges here that I did all those years ago, and that's because I began to realize despite this game's Metroidvania design, it kept the gameplay loop and feel we had in those older games. But why this experience was better is what I realized it was adding to that experience, perfectly blending old and new gameplay loops, and finally allowing Prince of Persia to evolve in a way that it hasn't before. The time magic makes a return, but here we can't turn back time. Instead, we can mess with elements of space and time itself, allowing us to double jump and wall run through the air, create after images that we can return to, then things interdimensional rifts for later use, and much more. The game makes us use these unique powers to solve puzzles and do complete traversal sections just like in those older games. The traps and puzzle sections we know and love also make their return, and here they're ingrained into Sargon's new power system. At some point, you will utilize every ability you've unlocked in some way, shape or form to unlock secret chests or open hidden passageways and shortcuts. What really makes this feel distinct, however, is the fact that those previous games were all linear. Here we are in a more open world setting that you can go through at your own pleasure, and that's what makes this feel so much better than those previous experiences, because now you can do so much more. The combat, however, is where things really start to deviate, but probably in the best way possible, as we can parry, dodge and air juggle enemies around, and it all feels so fast and fluid compared to those older games' more methodical approach to certain enemies. Not that that has disappeared entirely, as yes, you will have to use these powers to counter a lot of the enemies you come across, and not utilizing them will make your life a lot harder, along with not using the upgrades this game has on offer to your advantage. There were a number of unique ways to customize your combat experience, like equipping amulets, which you could slot in, and these would give you different buffs and change your gameplay experience. There were upgrades for your weapons that you could work towards making them a lot stronger. There were unique attacks you could discover and unlock to use whenever you wanted. All these changes and tweaks to the core experience come together perfectly, creating an entirely new type of game for this franchise, and one a lot of us didn't even know we wanted, as they felt just at home in the Prince of Persia experience. I'm happy to say the story is one of this game's strong points, as although not always being at the forefront, it does offer a unique and interesting take on the Prince of Persia story, despite you not playing as the prince. In this game we play as Sargon, a skilled warrior going by the name of Rashabar, or the Black Wind of Persia, which is actually a really cool nickname. Sargon is a member of the Seven Immortals, who are the strongest warriors in Persia and its protectors. These are essentially the characters this game's plot will mainly revolve around, and some of them are important while most of them fall off to the wayside. After discovering the Prince of Persia has been kidnapped, they track him down in Mount Kaf, which has the Curse of Time, and this is where our story begins. And the story here is one of betrayal. It feels like you can't really trust anyone and no one can trust you, resulting in fighting and killing almost anyone and anything you come across as you look for the prince. What doesn't help is that you've been framed as one of the prince's captors by other members of your group, so this leaves you with very few friends and very few people to turn to for help. I would have loved to see some assistance from the immortals outside of dialogue. In the older games, some characters would help the prince solve puzzles or assist in various ways, and that was something I didn't really experience, seeing as for the most part, everyone is against you, making the experience feel very isolated until those boss fight interactions. Like I previously mentioned, this game is one of betrayal and is packed full of plot twists and hidden reveals, and I think the writing is good enough in this game that you wouldn't really see most of them coming without some degree of spoilers beforehand. I definitely believe they told a great story in this game with the immersive use of framing, which is just impressive, and this makes the game feel like one long cutscene, as 1 second you're in dialogue and the next you're playing, and it all felt very dynamic for a side-scroller. I especially loved how the characters can appear at the front and back of the screen, making a 2.5D effect during some of the scenes. And that was only one of the ways they elevated the narrative. Another way they elevated the narrative was lore, as there was a lot of lore on future bosses or important figures who would appear to help you later on during your combat. There were also optional characters to interact with and learn from, like vendors and spirits that would appear on whack trees, and they would give you some insight into their thoughts or what was going on in the world around them. And I thought this was really useful, as sometimes you would hear names of important characters or events that could take place later on in the game, really helping to maintain your immersion in the game's atmosphere. The best addition to the story came in the form of side quests. A lot of them came from people stuck on Mount Kaf for years, and you would see how the curse had affected them over time and learn more about Mount Kaf and its secrets through these people. These extra details were great for world building and making the game feel less isolated, while also being a huge help to my explorations. I would discover things as I went around trying to complete these side quests. But like I pointed out before, I really appreciate the framing here. I really loved how you could transition between dialogue and gameplay so smoothly. This game often reminded me of that one sequence with Zeus in God of War 3, where you're just in the middle of dialogue and suddenly the frame pans to the side and it's time to throw down. I thought that was really cool, and I began to appreciate the way that the game was designed even more as a result. This kept you immersed in this game's atmosphere, as it didn't feel solely like a cutscene that had been split up, because the entire game feels like one long running cutscene, so every time there was any kind of movie or set piece you had to watch, it just felt like the transition to the next event. However, even more than the framing, I love the action in here. You can tell it's very anime inspired and visually interesting. As they were usually so over the top, it kept things very interesting. And what was really great here is how these epic displays would also smoothly make their way into the combat with Sargon's abilities or abilities from the bosses. They would make the battles feel so much more exciting, especially when the game really leans into that anime feel it's going for, leading to moments like this. Now, not everything in this game was epic and exciting all the time. There were a lot of moments that felt frustrating due to bugs or issues I had with the design. The bugs were not anything major, just some weird and silly wall phasing that did force me to backtrack from time to time, or my screen would randomly be zoomed in, but they had little hindrance to me aside from me maybe having to restart the game. I do think bugs are bad in any game, and I would have loved to not see them in what I thought was a nearly perfect experience, but I will say there really isn't any bugs that will ruin your entire experience, and the ones I saw here only occurred twice in my entire 24 hours of play. However, what my main issue was this game's hitbox registration. There were too many times where I didn't touch something visually, but I got hit by it anyway. And this can be annoying in boss fights, but absolutely the worst when doing the traversal sections with traps. As in this game, traps don't insta-kill you. You get sent back to a checkpoint nearby, and the slightest hit before you reach your next checkpoint would reset you to that position. Pairing that with a weird hitbox led to some really frustrating levels, especially the sand level that you unlock halfway through the game. That whole level is the part of the game I dread experiencing again the most, as it's riddled with crystal corners you had to avoid touching, and there were very long paths between these checkpoints, so being reset there just felt very time consuming. As a result, most of my game over screams was usually because of this, and unfortunately it also led me to stop trying to get Xerxes and other collectible items from certain areas because I simply didn't want to deal with how janky it might feel. Okay, back to the good stuff. Let's talk about this game's combat. There are a lot of things to love about this game, but to me the combat is actually its best quality. The combat here is so well done that I generally believe this should be the definitive Prince of Persia combat going forward. So the combat is designed in a way where it's easy to learn and hard to master. I came nowhere close to mastering it at all in my small 24 hours of playtime. You're going to be using your swords, your bow, your chakram, and various abilities interchangeably as you take on the large list of enemies this game has to offer. My favorite part of all this was the simple but very satisfying parry that's included here, as this allows the combat to flow smoothly when you pull it off, and even more so when it's an insta-kill parry that can lead to a very satisfying cutscene when pulled off. What I also really appreciated here is the game itself will teach you every playstyle and useful combo you will need from the arena, which I have to add is surprisingly in-depth, as the dialogue between Sargon and his friend and mentor Artaban lets this all feel like the training is part of the story, as Sargon and Artaban will discuss what's not really his style and what works best for him, and I really love that there's personality in that. There's also a lot to learn here, as there are combos for juggling enemies in the air, combos for follow-up attacks on the ground, and much more, leading to so many unique ways to fight in the game besides doing a simple square combo. In fact, the game will punish you for doing the same square combo on repeat, as over time it will become less effective, meaning that learning these combos is very much encouraged. On top of that variety, there are your choice of powers. These are called Afro Surges, and you can select them at the Whack Whack trees. These abilities use up meter and can lead to some big damage dealing attacks, and there's the added bonus that they look very exciting and over the top. They start at level 1 costing 1 bar of meter, level 2 costing 2 bars, and finally level 3 which uses up all 3 bars but does the most damage, and you can equip 2 of these at once, so I chose to go with a level 1 and a level 3 for most of my playthrough. This allowed me to have something I could use frequently and something I could save for stronger enemies. Now usually you'd have to build these meters by dealing damage, however through the use of amulets you can build them by taking damage as well, bringing me to the next part of the combat, amulets. These were basically the equivalent of perk selections. They could help you take less damage, increase your overall damage, or increase your overall health, and you could buy them from vendors for a price. However, from my personal experience, the best ones I discovered were usually while exploring or during the story. For example, I found an amulet that would create a time bubble every time I parried, and another that would set my arrows on fire, allowing me to inflict burn damage on enemies. Choosing between all these options meant that my combat continued to evolve the more I played, as I was constantly mixing and matching these skills around, which was great for dealing with this game's bosses. The bosses are without a doubt what you buy this game for. There are a lot of them and they are all very fun and unique. They all seem to have their own unique mechanics and ways to counter them, so each fight felt very distinct and different from the last, and they would often challenge you in new and interesting ways, making you use every single skill you had learned in the game up until that point. From parrying to teleporting to using all of your new time abilities, it was always a good way to test Sargon's arsenal, and I loved it. As you continue through the game, these challenges became more and more demanding, and the fight started getting super close, to the point where towards the end I was just scraping by, usually on a sliver of health remaining, which made for a very satisfying win. And learning the boss and its mechanics felt very Souls-like, in the sense that the boss fights upon repetition would feel like a dance, and you would be preparing and anticipating for a lot of these important moments during the fight. My personal favorite bosses here were the Forest Queen, who would take you into this kind of alternate realm and play some kind of minigame with you where you had to survive by parrying and dodging certain attacks, and Varun, who was just interesting to fight because of his unique skill set and style compared to the other bosses in the game, who were often larger and slower. Varun was fast and his attacks were harder to read, so it felt like the first true challenging boss fight in the game for me. I just really enjoyed how each of these fights were a test to see how good you had become at using certain abilities, or chaining combos together, or parrying, and it all felt very satisfying when you had gotten past them. Which is why I have to say, the fluid combat here allows you to experiment with so many creative and satisfying ways to kill enemies, and enhance all those methods that you have found with unique items or abilities, so it can really be a fun and challenging experience. Now, like I said at the start of the video, despite all the fancy combat and boss fights, this game is a Prince of Persia game, and I don't mean like the Sands of Time games alone. I mean like the classic games that you used to play on a library computer, where you hop and skip around various traps to discover hidden items and passageways. And this game had hidden abilities, boss fights, and even more loot to discover. Despite me saying this is an open world, do not be fooled. This game is made up of levels, and these levels are all connected together, and they all required their own gameplay styles that the player will have to adapt to. Some levels made me focus on stealth, others made me have to overcome certain combat situations. Some levels made me use various abilities for traversal so I could get to the next point of the story. While doing all this, you'll be making detours to collect resources and various materials, as there is a lot to discover, and a lot of what you will discover will want to kill you. There are a bunch of currencies that you're going to want to grab in this game. The universal one is shards, and this is used by most vendors in the game for all sorts of items and is the most common to find. Now, on top of currencies like shards, there are valuable ores, which are a very rare find, but using these can provide a big damage increase to weapons, but the upgrade fee will become more expensive the more you do it. There were also Xerxes, which can be used on one vendor in the game in particular for some very strong amulets that will alter your gameplay quite a bit. However, these can be used to buy other things as well. You'll spend a lot of your time in this game upgrading and collecting, so exploration is important, and it's also important for your story progression. For my playthrough, I chose to play this game on standard difficulty and exploration mode, so there were a lot of times in the story where I was like, where do I go, or what should I do next? Fortunately, if you did get stuck like myself, you could visit a vendor called Faraba who happened to be selling hints, but I wanted to figure everything out in the story by myself, so I never really chose this option. However, Faraba could also be found in various zones in hidden rooms, and she would sell maps that would allow you to fully explore the area, as it showed you everywhere you hadn't gone yet. This made my life a lot easier and would allow me to find a lot more resources and shortcuts. If you pre-ordered this game, you would get an amulet that would grant you a magical bird that would follow you around and whistle when you were near treasure. Now, don't worry if you didn't pre-order the game, as the game does have a free alternative for those who didn't pre-order. It will just take you slightly longer to unlock that ability. But I thought this feature was really nice, as these treasure hunting and exploration moments were the most relaxing points in the game for me, being left to my own devices to come up with a way to progress the story and my gear. And this is when I really started to appreciate the Metroidvania approach to a game like this, as I think it felt right at home. What also helped is that all of these zones had their own personality. There was a story or something more to all of them, and you could see that just by looking at them. The art and music also helped in establishing their beautiful atmospheres, making them even more distinct from each other. The gameplay required of each of these levels made them entertaining and exciting to explore for the first time, as you were always doing so with a mechanic, and I really love how they tested Sargon's abilities in exchange for more loot and materials, or even more side quests and boss fights from time to time. This made the gameplay loop and exploration on Mount Kaf that much more engaging, and I can't wait to go through it all again. This game, for the value of what it costs to what it offers, is 100% worth the pickup. I can already see the replayability available here, as on my first clear I only had 65% completion, so this could have easily been a 30 hours or more experience depending on my skill level. The fact this game is on the Switch makes me a little jealous, as I would love to be able to play this on the go, so hopefully one day when I get my Steam Deck, I will return and be able to play this while I'm on the train during my morning commute. And most importantly, this game proves something to me. When Ubisoft execs aren't saying dumb things to annoy gamers, and people are allowed to create something they care about and want people to enjoy without it being overpriced or overly monetized, it seems Ubisoft can cook up some really high quality games. And I mean really good games. Games that give the player a brilliant, well-crafted story, a deep combat system that is easy to learn but hard to master, games that players can sink over 30 hours into due to how much there is to explore and discover. And that's without me considering the large amount of replayability on offer here. I truly believe this game has proved itself as the perfect evolution to the Prince of Persia experience, as it has the adventure, the action, and puzzling and traversal sections that are core to this experience, but adds in its own gameplay elements that serve to uplift that core experience, like the Metroidvania approach being a good way for players to experience the exploration these games are known for, making players dodge traps and solve puzzles in order to progress and unlock various combat upgrades that they will need to deal with this game's challenging and more advanced take on its enemy encounters and boss fights. The 2D side-scroller perspective is stylistic but feels right at home, as this is where these games started, but it doesn't mean I wouldn't love to see this design in a more traditional AAA format, as I think people would still love that as well. However, this serves to show that style direction and overall presentation are important to how a game is enjoyed, as like many others, I wasn't too excited when the trailer for this game dropped. I'm very happy I played it and got to experience the over-the-top anime-inspired action and its interesting uses of depth and positioning and storytelling. This game is an experience, the Prince of Persia experience, and if you haven't played the originals, or any in the franchise, I would say start here. This is the best offering so far in my opinion, as it's a full package and will give you everything you need to understand why this is a beloved franchise. Ubisoft, you guys have done an incredible job, and I can't wait to see these developers return with a sequel or DLC. This is an incredible way to start off 2024.